So I'll follow that termination for breach. So following the notes, where we left off will be, the next topic will be termination for breach, and then anticipatory deviation. The termination for breach is still, I would say, within this idea of interpretation, construction of contracts, and picks up from what we were talking about yesterday, in that once you classify the terms, or usually when the terms are classified, is after there's a problem, and there's an allegation of a breach of some kind. You're looking to determine what can be done with it. So a lot of the cases we'll look at, or that you'll find, are on termination for breach. That map this out. I think the first heading is meaning of termination for breach, and then you have photo production and secure report. Is that right?
Yeah.
Did I give you the summary for this? Photo production. I did? Okay. Thank you. So this case, we'll come back to it. Sorry?
We don't have the summary.
We have page 8.
So we'll come back to this case a bit later, but for now, what we're looking at, the question that I'd ask is this a breach of contract? Where the contract is about photo production hiring a security guard from Securicor, the defendant, to provide security for its factory. And arguably, at least, the security guard did the antithesis of securing the premises. He burned them down. He was trying to keep warm. He didn't do it on purpose. So in the note, you'll see discussion of fundamental breach. And the question here is there's this concept called fundamental breach. And up until photo production and Securicor, there's this idea that you could argue fundamental breach and everybody knew what you were talking about. And it was a product of Lord Dennings. Fundamental breach, the premise is sometimes there's a breach so big you can automatically terminate the contract. And that's what photo production is arguing here. And they lost. And we'll dissect why. But first of all, the House of Lords says there is no argument for rule of law called fundamental breach. It's a rule of construction. What they mean by that is when we're looking at a contract, the idea of a fundamental breach is how is the contract constructed. So if we're looking for a condition versus a warranty for innominate term, which will be either way, then what we're looking for is how have the parties constructed the contract. It's not necessarily something that you can say is automatic. And I think photo production illustrates this point. Because in a non-legal sense, I think we may all agree that burning the factory down by a security guard would constitute a big problem with regards to performance or good performance of the contract. But photo production could not sue Securicor Why was that?
Security Corps didn't breach the contract, per se. It was the-
Well, no, so we won't be getting into it in tort, but there's a concept called vicarious liability, where the sins of the worker are transferred to the employer.
Because of the existence of the exclusion clause.
Right. So there's a clause in the contract that says if one of Securicor's employees does something wrong, they are not liable. We exclude liability. So what we have here is a clause in the contract that both parties agreed to that says if Securicor's employee does something wrong, photo production cannot sue them. Liability is excluded. So what the House of Lords is saying is you can't automatically say if the breach is bad enough, you can terminate. You have to look at what does the contract say. In this case, there was an exclusion clause. Yesterday, we looked at Hong Kong First, and the court said that the innocent party had to be substantially deprived, had to be deprived of the substantial benefit of the contract. So what we're picking up from yesterday is this point of looking at the contract in its entirety. What have the parties agreed to? How have they arranged their affairs? And in the photo production case, the exclusion clause is an important aspect of that contract because it says the parties have agreed to this. Namely, that if Securicor's employee does something like literally burn the place down, Securicor can't be sued for. So you'll find, excuse me, you'll find mention of exclusion clauses often, especially in commercial contracts, or in the alternative, you'll find limitation of liability clauses. The idea behind these is that in a contract, a large part of what the parties are doing is allocating risk between each other. If this happens, who bears the responsibility if it goes wrong? So in this case, the House of Lords did not interfere with that contract. They said, well, you are both commercial parties. You understood what was going on. You had the benefit of legal advice. So we're not going to interject in that. Even though we could argue something catastrophic happened. That you could say, well, surely this would eliminate anything in the contract. It's just such a bad breach, or in other words, a fundamental breach. So the idea of termination of a contract is something that is subject to interpreting the contract. So if we move to the subheading, the relative importance of terms, aerial advertising. Why was the defendant allowed to terminate the contract in this case? Aerial advertising and bachelor's fees.
The type of the advertisement is not the one, is not matching the requirements of the...
Not the type of advertisement.
The date of?
Yeah, the timing.
Yeah, timing.
What was so bad about this timing?
It was the moment of 2 minute silence of the
First World War.
Yeah.
So keep this in mind. You've just gone through what we now call the Great War. You're observing 2 minutes of silence, and Bachelor's Peace decides this is the moment that they're going to advertise, please buy our product. It's not a good look. And Bachelor of Peace says, well, you actually did the opposite of advertise for us. You brought us negative publicity, basically, because we now look like we're trying to capitalize on a captive audience when they're remembering probably somebody passed away in their family as a result of the war, and we just look very bad. So in this case, Bachelor of Peace was allowed to terminate based upon the construction of the contract, that this was a breach of a condition, namely that the timing of flights had to be pre-approved. And by failing to do that, the court went a bit further and said, well, confidence was destroyed. I think what they're saying there is what Lord Denning a few decades later is talking about with fundamental breach. This is just such a bad breach that there's no turning back. So if we think of Hong Kong first, even though you couldn't use the ship, the charter party couldn't use the ship for, as I said, I modified the facts, a quarter of the time, the parties could still deal with each other. In Bachelor's Peace, that's not a possibility here. The next case, Mordelanto. So I gave you the issue was clause 1 a condition or a warranty. It was found to be a condition. Why? What was breach? I think I gave you the summary, didn't I? Okay. So in the facts, what was breach?
The clause, there was a clause.
Clause 1, yeah. But what did it say?
NOR clause.
Sorry?
Notice of readiness clause.
Yeah.
Yes, and then the court held that these types of clause usually always considered repudiatory breach. So
Yep.
that's why.
Now, how late were they, though? They were supposed to notify the charter party on the 1st of July, but only did so about, what, like 12, 13 days later.
Yeah.
I found this case kind of surprising in a shipping context, because ships don't necessarily, we have airplanes don't arrive on time, but ships, you can't really say, we will be there that day. And it's that kind of precision, because, excuse me, ships are delayed oftentimes by for a variety of reasons. So I was surprised at this interpretation. Now, why was the charter party lucky in this case, based on the facts?
Because they couldn't find the goods.
Not only could they not find the goods, they didn't
were
know.
non-existing.
Yeah.
Actually. So they were completely busted in terms of whatever they wanted to do, but initially they tried to pull, that argument, they abandoned. So they said breach of contract because they didn't show up in time.
Yeah, so in fact, the charter party was remarkably lucky, because I don't know who rents a ship to pick up something that actually doesn't exist in that part of the world.
I have a question, so.
So do I.
The exact definition of the charter party, so can you expand it more? So charter party.
What does it mean?
Yeah, exactly.
So as I said yesterday, that's the
I
part.
guess what is it, but I want to know the exact.
What I said yesterday was, think of renting a car.
Yeah,
If you go into a car rental place, you are renting the car, so you are the renter.
yes.
The charter party is the renter of the ship. So, I don't understand, like, there's a special brand of stupidity, I think.
I didn't understand this case, why they didn't talk, or I don't understand.
But
I mean,
it's sort
they
of,
didn't talk, they couldn't ask each other. I just-
well, but not only
Everybody was
that,
waiting for the
but why
other.
do you rent you know, it's like I'm going to rent a car to go to Ottawa to watch the Maple Leafs. They play in Toronto. You know, like, surely you can figure out basic things like that ahead of time. But I sort of joke with the case to underscore the point that we have a range of interpretations that the courts can speak to. We can have a bit more of a liberal interpretation, which maybe Hong Kong Furs is. Maybe Hong Kong Furs, in your estimation, goes a bit too much to one side. I would say Mordelanto is quite of a strict interpretation of the clause 1, that the vessel will be ready on the 1st of July and arrives mid-July. I didn't think necessarily in a shipping context that was a huge, huge difference. Yeah.
I was wondering whether the following would be kind of appropriate to be said. Basically, motives as to what one party would claim to be the reason for the breach that happen outside of the time when the actual contract was made are irrelevant in terms of the interpretation.
Yeah.
In other words, those guys were struggling to find a reason, which was post factum, after the contract was made. It's irrelevant for the court, although they can see between the lines that
Yeah.
someone is trying to pull the short one on the other side, and they said, well, it was a condition.
Yeah.
Carved in a rock,
Yeah, I
done
think-
before. Sorry about that?
I think they were kind of lucky on that. It
Very
just so
lucky.
happened. Because as I said, like, what kind of operation are you running? I've never been to North Vietnam. I don't intend on going. But if you're going to rent a ship to somewhere that's not like Florida, let's say, you should know why you're going there. I didn't think that was really Mensa type thinking. But as Dayon says, they were just lucky. And
Oh,
the-
you said they were lucky.
So picking up on last night's discussion for this question, how would you advise a client who is an innocent party in a breach scenario? That's why I said you have this range or scope of interpretation where you have Hong Kong Furs, which is arguably a bit of a liberal interpretation of the contract. Then you have, what was the case, Mordelanto, which is more of a strict interpretation. You said July 1st, it came on July 13th, that's a breach of a condition. So if you're advising the innocent party in a breach scenario, I think you have to really bear in mind that range of interpretation, the scope of interpretation, that you may get the Mordelanto type of reasoning. Now I'm using these as sort of archetypes, Mordelanto to represent strict, Hong Kong Furs to be more of a liberal interpretation. But this is the scope that the court can employ. Nicholas.
Would you say Madolanto is even more surprising if you look at the wording of the clause? Because it says the vessel is expected ready to load. What does that mean? It doesn't mean it has to be there at
Yeah.
that time, just it has to be expected to arrive. At what point in time does it have to be expected to arrive at that time? Isn't that even...
That's the thing, it's, especially, and I'm keeping this to shipping. I'm not saying, if you rent a car and the dealership says it'll be here in 2 weeks, that wouldn't be acceptable. But in commercial shipping, things operate a bit differently. As if you probably are learning more about shipping than you might have known through what's happening in Iran with the Strait of Hormuz. So things don't operate on tight schedules in shipping. And so it's interesting that the court didn't seem to take that into consideration. They applied what I would call more of a strict contractual analysis. You said this, you didn't do it, you're in breach.
It just sounded to me that by the use of the word expect, it kind of sounds like we think it will be here on July 1st. Like promising.
About,
Yeah.
even
think
more
about-
weight, even more weight about, what does it mean?
Yeah. Well, you would think that there'd be some leeway. Clearly, the court is saying not that much. But as I say, I think that's a fine distinction that they're making that you generally don't find in cases. But courts are permitted to take that approach. Yeah. And I've already read it.
Yes.
So I'll come back to you.
So for the purpose of listening, so we are thinking that, for example, in Hong Kong case, so there was a different test in order to trigger the breach, which is whether or not the innocent party deprived from the substantial benefit.
I wouldn't call it a different test. Because if we applied, I'll finish the point, if we applied that test in Hong Kong FERS of depriving the innocent party of the substantial benefit,
Yes.
in Mortalanto, the court is saying you did. It's just a different interpretation of what constitutes deprivation of a substantial benefit.
No, this
Yeah.
wasn't my exact question. But in photo production, so the court says that, okay, you have to focus on the construction of the contract and the terms, the clause. So in terms of, like, for the purpose of the exam, so which one we have to follow? Can we follow one of those cases, or which one is like?
What we'll find
in
is
those
an
days?
exclusion clause is a very powerful clause. So I'll come back to that when we
Yeah.
get to exclusion clauses on Monday. But generally speaking, your question goes to, is sort of treating Mortalanto and Hong Kong FERS along the same lines as photo production.
Yeah.
Photo production is distinct because of the presence of the exclusion clause. So the exclusion clause says, even if we mess up, it's not our fault.
And this rule is.
Whereas these ones are about
specifically-
the type of performance rendered and what constitutes meeting the contractual obligations of the contract. So with the exclusion clause, it's saying, we admit that if we fall below what we should have done, it's still not our fault, and the other party agrees to it. So just for a more general point, part of what you do in the common law often is issue identification. And part of that is identifying what is the legal issue here. And implied with that, within that is there are different categories of issues. So photo production is an exclusion clause issue. The other two cases are an issue of interpretation, construction of the contract.
Bettini case,
Sorry?
in Bettini case, what's the difference? The
In the which
exclusion?
case, sorry?
Bettini and Guy, one person promised to perform rehearsals, but
Sorry, I didn't catch the name.
one person in Bettini and Guy, 1876.
Oh, Bettini and Guy.
The opera singer.
Okay,
Opera
yeah,
singer.
yeah, sorry.
What's the difference with this case and
Again,
Mare?
within Martelanto, the court could have said, you weren't there in time, that's it. I don't think that was, that would be the more likely interpretation. I think what the court said in Bettini and Hong Kong Furs would be more leeway given. But we have to be aware that there are cases like Martelanto, which are a strict application. So what I'm saying, in recalling what I talked about at the beginning, some cases won't fit together. And arguably, these don't. And the way I suggested to package them is, as I'm doing now, there are cases that generally show there will be a more liberal interpretation so as to preserve the contract, but there are still some cases that give a strict application, a strict interpretation of the contract, like Martelanto. And that's the scope within which the courts can operate, depending on the contract, clearly. But without more details, it seems like in Martelanto, the court took a very strict line. It was July 1st, and even July 2nd wouldn't be satisfactory, you were late. But as I say, I don't think that would be the majority reasoning if we took 10 times, if we did that case 10 times. I think more likely it'd be like Hong Kong Furs and Bettini. Going down to termination clauses. So we have two different views of termination clauses, with these two different cases. And a termination clause, excuse me, is put in to say, and some people I think were asking questions kind of touching on this yesterday. What if I put in the contract that if X happens, I can terminate? Can the parties do that? And we have different interpretations of it. So if we look at the first case, Lombard North Central, what did the court find here?
Yes, the court found that when the issue goes to the root of the contract, so this means that the category of obligation is called condition. And upon the occurrence of the breach of the condition, the party can terminate, can elect either to terminate or claim tax damages,
Okay.
depending on the grant of the condition.
Now, I think we need to sort of unpack a bit what you said. What goes to the root of the contract? We've seen examples already where arguably breaches have gone to the root of the contract, but it doesn't allow for the courts having said the innocent party to be terminated. So here, they allowed the innocent party to terminate. Why do you think they did?
Non-payment.
There was a clause 5.
Yeah. Yeah,
Or they can, again, rent to someone else and actually make double money. That's why they terminated.
I guess they could, yeah.
I think-
Constantino, and then I'll come back, Belcar and Peter.
Didn't they consider the time impaction payment essential? Time is of essence?
So that, if I could just expand on that, you have clause 5 and you have clause 6. So the contract read as a whole, I know we only have a couple of clauses here, but the contract indicated that the parties had turned their attention to what if punctual payment is not made. If that's the case, then clause 6 allows the innocent party to terminate and collect, basically. Alcor, thank you.
Yeah, so I was thinking potentially we can take a look at the entirety of the contract, the whole performance is predicated on them leasing a computer. And essentially, if you can't really keep up with your payments and you go into arrears, you're pretty much going towards the root of that contract. So for me, it was basically leasing out computers and the consideration of payments for the lease itself. So I would consider that to be substantially part of the root of the contract.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Theodore.
Yeah, that's what I was about saying, that it goes to the root of the contract as a whole.
Right, and what I was at, that's what Talar said, and what I was trying to draw out, because whether it's an exam or in court, it's not enough to just say that, you have to explain why. And that's why I elaborated on, you have clause 5, clause 6, so the agreement gives us this indication that the parties had constructed the contract in a certain way that if this happened, termination would be permissible. Because, why I'm bringing this up is, we have the next case, Rice, that doesn't allow a termination clause to be triggered based on these facts. Sorry, I remember now, I forgot to come back to you.
Can I ask, this is a case where one of the parties is a business, obviously, and the other is just a private person, right?
No, so one is a government agency and the other is a private contractor.
Yeah, I'm just, I find that basically they want, I mean, he didn't pay at the beginning already, right? And they wanted all the future installments also,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So it looked, I don't know how much the parties were in the same, I mean, how much they were balanced in power when they agreed on these terms. And if it's consumer protection now, I see that this case is from 87, right?
Sorry, Rice. No, we're talking about Rice.
2000.
Or were you asking about Lombard?
Yeah, I'm asking about the Lombard.
Oh, sorry, I thought,
Sorry.
sorry. So, if you could repeat your question then.
So my problem is that I feel like it's a bit too harsh, no, for Butterworth to pay all the future installments also and losing the computer also.
Yeah,
And I'm just wondering if the parties are not balanced in power.
yeah, and
Then
inequality of
can you
bargaining
make
power.
such harsh terms?
But I think we have to look at, first of all, I would say that in most commercial contracts, there's somebody who's in a weaker position. The question really is, how much?
That's what I'm asking, that here one is.
And here, the court didn't find that to be the case. That both parties signed on to these terms. They may operate in these facts in a harsh manner, and the court isn't going to interfere with that because that's what the parties agreed to. So, Rice, Constantine.
In Rice, the court interprets the termination clause not literally, but gives prior in a way that takes into account circumstances and 4-year period, so it takes into account the whole period, and the breach is made by both parties. So even though the clause gave rise,
The council, not Rice.
yes.
So Rice was breaching,
So,
and the council said, you missed one of your appointments with us. We
so,
can terminate.
yeah, and the court, even though the parties have signed this clause, it was not interpreted literally, so it was treated as a nominate term, not as a condition, so the consequences of the breach, depending on the seriousness of the consequences, and because it was regarded that the consequences were not as severe as to deprive the substantial benefit of the whole contract, so that's why they did not allow the council to terminate.
Yeah.
And also, I think
Sorry.
the council was acting in a Glen-Northley manner, so they took into account.
Yeah, I think the court wasn't too impressed with the council. This guy misses one appointment, and the council says, okay, that's it. Enrico.
Yeah, I think there was, in this case, real no emphasis on any breach. If I recall, the contract was pretty like a template contract.
Yeah.
Just outlining this is what's going to happen when it's breached. And maybe the court looked at it compared to the other case that there was an emphasis on the payment and the time that was critical. In this case, it was like a kind of template contract, but it was that one breach of the federal was meant to be more important than the other.
Yeah.
And so they might have said, look, this is kind of the defendant's going to suffer the same consequences for that breach, so there's no real emphasis on the one particular breach.
Yeah. This was one visit out of many.
Yeah. It's just like, you do this, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this. So what is actually fundamental case contract?
Yeah.
You guys actually decide what's going to be the tipping point.
Ever.
Yeah, it's a like it seemed like still vague if the court gonna like adopt a liberal interpretation for the contract or a strict interpretation. So we cannot say that for sure the court's gonna say like no, it's not like a substantial breach of the contract that's allowing you to terminate or not. Right?
Yeah.
So we cannot determine. There's no like test.
Yeah, but I think what Enrico was talking about, I think, was trying to say there are certain circumstances in which we could relatively certainly predict what the court will say. And I suggest the Rice case, the facts are one of those. That if you have a situation where you have, let's say, a weekly visit that's contracted for, and the one party misses that visit, the court is not going, misses one visit, sorry, the court is not going to allow the innocent party to then say, okay, that's it, I can terminate. And in the decision, they rely on Hong Kong first to say, well, we as a court can pursue an overly technical analysis of the contracts, but that doesn't move us anywhere to be overly technical. It just allows people to terminate contracts for arguably unimportant reasons. So what we're going to do is, in a situation like this, is say, look, you missed it, deal with it yourselves, maybe you give money back or whatever it is, but the contract continues. We're not going to allow you to take an overly technical approach. Now, compare that to Martelanto, where you have July 1st, and you can say, well, isn't that an overly technical analysis? And my response would be, and this is what I think Enrico was trying to say, he was comparing the, I think you were comparing the two.
So yes,
Yeah.
two cases.
It's a different set of facts in Mar de Lanto. Mar de Lanto, the idea was the ship is supposed to be there. I agree it may be an overly strict interpretation of when it should be there, but I think it's more open for a court to be strict there than it would be in the Rice set of facts, where you have a series of performance items and you miss one, as Enrico said, 1 out of 10. They're not going to be likely to say the innocent party can terminate the contract in that scenario. So factually, we can distinguish the scenarios between Mar de Lanto and Rice. Constantine. Next, sorry.
But I find hard to reconcile Hong Kong with...
With Rice?
No, with Manhattan.
Maybe this similar thinking.
Because they both involve ships, so the one you have an exact day of arrival, and then...
Yeah, but the key term in Hong Kong was what constitutes unseaworthy. And Lord Diplock says, well, this term unseaworthy is not defined in the contract and not defined generally. And he sort of goes a bit, he exaggerates a bit. He says, well, maybe a nail out or a door that doesn't work could be seen as unseaworthy. And we're not going to enter into that. So where there's scope for the courts to assess a situation, like Hong Kong Furs, Rice, I would say they're going to, more likely than not, side on the side of the contract being preserved. Mar de Lanto, I think, as I said, seems to be a bit more strict, but nonetheless is open to the court just because the facts were a bit different.
So with Hong Kong, the word unseaworthy, they give rise to, let's say, broader scope of interpretation. Whereas when we have more, let's say, wording that does not kind of have different interpretation is very...
So in, I think Dayan and Nicholas were talking about in Mar de Lanto, the wording wasn't on July 1st. They said it was about. So arguably there's scope, but in the court's opinion, that didn't mean July 13 or 14. So it was more confined in terms of what was at issue.
So how did the court reach this conclusion that
In where?
in defining how many days we can?
I don't know. That's the thing. Like that's why I said sometimes we'll get these cases. Put another way, what I said. Sometimes we'll get these cases. And in terms of our work, all we can do is say, well, we should remember what happened there, because this is an appellate level decision and it can happen again. And that's what I was saying. The majority of times, I think it'll be a more liberal interpretation so as to preserve the contract. But we have to be aware of a more strict interpretation. And in Mar de Lanto, I'm sort of looking at it, trying to justify retroactively. The court, I think, was just saying, well, you said this time, and the time you had the ship was beyond a reasonable period. And we're not going to bend over just to keep this contract alive.
So I'm looking at aerial advertising and Rice, where it was held that the act of one of the contracting parties destroyed confidence. I mean, it was just one advertising out of maybe 5.
Yeah, that's why I went into detail about what was that one event. That one event was a pretty big error.
Yeah, but it's a council. I mean, you don't show up in Rice.
Oh, right, yeah.
In Rice, right?
I was talking about aerial.
Right, so I'm now contrasting
Yeah.
it with Rice. I could submit that it's also major. I mean, this is a council. You don't show up.
Yeah, but and going back to Enrico's point, this was one of several items that was breached. It wasn't like an aerial. You fly this during Armistice Day at the exact time that we're having 2 minutes of silence. I didn't approve that. That's bringing negative publicity to us. It may be one instance, but it's a really big mess up. In Rice, it wasn't such that, based on the facts, it wasn't such that it was comparable to what happened in aerial advertising. Because you had several performance items, and one of several was not adhered to. And the courts don't want to get into an overly technical analysis of what constitutes repudiatory breach, so as to preserve the contracts, going back to what we were talking about last night with the importance of formation of a contract. The courts don't want to let people out of contracts for just whatever reason. Valcar and then Zita.
I was just gonna say something like you already brought up before too, but I think because everything's gonna be subjected just to the case acts. And then when you contract with Rice, you know, if you're just trying to maintain a public park or sports facility, if you miss one day, I don't think people are gonna notice something if the grass kind of goes a little bit taller, in contrast to the aerial case where it's pretty much detrimental to the business. It's bad publicity.
Yeah. Yeah, so if we think in exam terms, I would say if you were given facts, part of your argument can be on the exam facts, what is closer to that scenario? Aerial or Rice? Zita.
Yeah, I'm just asking the practical terms, because obviously the lawyers, when they wrote such a draconian terms for any breach,
Okay.
was probably to protect their party, right?
Yeah, but the other
But
party
then
agreed
it
to.
backfired, obviously,
In which case, though?
in this rise. In the rise, basically whatever legal
Yeah.
breach made reason to terminate,
Yeah.
that was the term, right? But
Yeah.
it's a very, very strong
Right.
condition, but it backfired, because basically after, if it's not so draconian,
Yeah.
the court might not get into.
So what do we draw from that? I think there's instruction to be drawn from that, and we touched on it already last night and today.
Yeah, you have to be careful. I mean,
That-
either you have to elaborate it more,
Well,
or when you go to court, you have to be careful.
that the court will, the contract will not be definitive when it comes to classifying terms as a conditional or warranty. We get that from the
Yes,
Schuler
yes,
case.
yes,
And I think Rice basically repeats that,
yeah.
where the court's saying, that's nice, but this is one out of many. We know Rice agreed to it, but you're being overly technical, and we're not going to set a precedent, because for all the years that we've been operating the English course, we haven't done it, so we're not going to start now with this one item kind of analysis. Ebra and then Enrico.
So it doesn't matter if we have a clause of like termination.
No, it can, but remember, so Schuler, what we talked about last night was, if you classify something as a condition, so in this case, if you have a termination clause that says breach of X constitutes breach of a condition that allows the innocent party to terminate, the court will say, okay, let's look at that. But in Rice, they said, no, we're not going to do that, because in these facts, it was just one out of several points. Whereas in sorry, what was the other termination case? Lombard. In Lombard, it was definitive based on how we interpret the contract as a whole. The parties had turned their attention to sort of a step-by-step process, clause 5 and clause 6, as to what happened. Enrico, and then...
I was just going to say, I think it's a lesson to lawyers or anybody drafting contracts that you're going to try to construct a multitude of escape clauses in terms of the contract, but that's not necessary. Because at the end of the day, the clauses that you're going to include in a contract should be fundamental to the actual agreement. I mean,
Yeah.
there's no way of saying, hey, lawyers, like, stop trying to
I'd amend it a
protect
bit.
the client and.
I'd amend it a little bit because I think, to be fair to lawyers, because we are, you're drafting a contract prospectively. You don't know what's going to happen. So you're trying to provide a framework of tools. And in that case, in Rice, your client decided, I'm going to use this tool in a very technical way. So, as the lawyer, you do what the client tells you. I'm sure they probably told them, look, this may not all go perfectly if you decide to rely upon it in a technical way. They did anyway, and therefore. So I'm just a bit more, I don't want to blame lawyers necessarily on that. Sometimes the biggest problem is the client.
I mean, it's really an extension of what you've already been asked and commented on, but if the parties have legislated explicitly that even the flimsiest breach, let's say payment has to be made by close of business and it's paid at 5:01, but the language is explicit and clear, I presume that a court would be precluded from actually gainsaying that clear language.
Sorry, going and saying, so 501, they would not be able to overrule the party.
If the language is clear.
If it is clear, then yeah, and when we get into the interpretation, I'll show some interesting examples of that. But stepping back, going to Ehan's question earlier, I want to reiterate there is a scope within which common law courts are operating. And it's important to keep that in mind. So if we're trying to look at the cases as, well, this isn't logical, case 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 that we've looked at. And I've said, don't look for the logic, look at it as, well, here are cases for one side and here are cases for the other side. And you can't predict how things will apply necessarily in any set of facts until you're given them. So, in your point, 501, the court may not be able to override that depending on the circumstances and the contract. Daniel.
Just a quick question. I'm thinking of whatever you're saying. So, would it be fair really to say that the longer the contract is, like, Lombard, Rice, Hong Kong for that Mordolento versus Mordolento, like all the previous ones, they were long-standing service contracts between commercial entities. Like we're talking 24 months.
Right.
We're talking 4 or 5 years. Would it be fair to assume that some kind of influence is seeping in terms of interpretation from the employment law, where you have long-standing, connections protected much more than quick relationships? For example, Mordolento, the trip from Hamburg to North Vietnam is what, 1 month with the boat? 2 months?
I don't intend to find out.
Oh, probably. So, nothing comparing to a very long-standing thing that is working up the letters by itself, and then you're
Yeah.
looking how the thing is actually affecting that long-term relationship. Because it seems to me that I'm not trying to say that it is, but it looks to me that long-term standing relationship will be protected more fiercely by the court. In a
Can
sense,
be. It can, so what they is referring to in contract law, they call it relational contracts. In relational contracts, you'll see it when you get to the good faith cases, especially BASM makes reference to relational contracts. The idea behind relational contracts is that these are long-term relationships that are built up between the parties over, as you say, many years. And it's not just a contract, it's the relationship that has been factored in. Generally, the common law courts, for whatever reason, have not looked at contracts that way. They've more employed the discrete one-off kind of analysis and downplayed anything long-term. I'm not 100% sure why. Conjecture is that there are cases that have been long-term, and then one party decides one day we're going to stop this, and the other party says, well, you can't do that to me, how dare you? I'm
I
going to
know
take
you
you to
for
court.
years, right?
Yeah. So I think courts are afraid of saying, if the contract goes on long enough, we can't do anything about it. That's just conjecture, I'm not sure, but generally speaking, they don't necessarily take into consideration the relational aspect. And this is a difference with from employment contracts. Employment law or employment contracts are often seen as a subset, just as we touched on it, consumer contracts would be viewed differently from the majority of contracts we look at here, which are commercial in nature.
I'm wondering whether you mentioned that there is scope that the court can, how the court can interpret a term found with benefit or draconian approach, as in Hong Kong Fur, as contrasted with the Nampak case. So I'm wondering whether in the Nampak case, the transaction is structured in such a way that actually the court's hand is tied, because there is a clause tied to the consequence of termination, say that the clause 6, so that if there is termination, then the party can recoup some arrears. But if the court did not classify as termination, then obviously this claim is not available to the party. And I think this clause and the claim to the arrears actually is very important to the party. So that the court's hand is tied, because if
in Lombard versus Rice.
in Lombard, if the courts took a very liberal approach, then the party's intention will not be fulfilled.
Yeah, I understand that. I think there's just a limitation to how far we can go with it, because was the intention of the parties any less present in Rice? If Rice signed on to the agreement, arguably Rice agreed to it. So I understand what you're saying, but I don't think we can expand it too far, is my point. I'm going to move on to interpretation.
In this case, I think that I have read a lot of cases that there's usually like the court trying to protect the weaker party, and there are a lot of cases in this, like following this approach. So, like, even the party doesn't have the right to raise the argument that, for example, for certain reasons, for example, he or she like signed, for example, they might be misrepresenting the representation or something leading in terms of the clauses and all that stuff. So is this type of protection comes only for the consumer type of relationship, or?
The weaker party analysis is generally for consumers.
Yeah.
Where it comes into commercial contracts, it is more if you can show a vitiating factor like duress, misrepresentation, unconscionability. But those are very discrete circumstances. And especially in a commercial setting, tend not to arise. Except for, I want to clarify because you have an essay question on one, maybe there's a debate about unconscionability within the setting of Heller, Uber versus Heller.
I noticed you mentioned going on to interpretation. Are you skipping over anticipatory?
Yeah. So interpretation. I've tried to give you a few quotations from cases that I hope will serve as guidelines as we're going through the cases. So the first one is Schuler and Wickman, which we've already talked about. The question to be answered always is, what is the meaning of what the party has said, not what did the parties mean to say. And that's an important distinction to keep in mind, I think, because when you get to court, your client is going to say what they think will win the case, not what they said necessarily. So the courts are looking at this on an objective basis. The Eli Lilly case, it is unnecessary to consider any extrinsic evidence at all when the document is clear and unambiguous on its face. Extrinsic evidence is evidence outside of the contract and the setting against which the contract was made.
Excuse me, which case you talked about?
So, under interpretation, the heading, interpretation, you have it? And then Lawrence Petroleum, extrinsic evidence cannot be used to explain the plain meaning of words, but it can be utilized to demonstrate that words have acquired a special meaning as a result of some custom. Now, this concern about extrinsic evidence and the parameters of interpretation stems from the court's concern that people can try to throw in any sort of argument to explain or support their position for how they interpreted the contract. And the court is going to say, look, we can only deal with the contract before us and maybe any ideas behind the industry. For example, if it's a shipping contract, we will consider that this was a shipping industry case. So they're reluctant to bring in a lot of other matters. And two guiding cases, even in Canada, come from the UK. The Prenn and Simmons case and Reardon Smith. Both are decisions or opinions of Lord Wilberforce. Looking at Prenn, the time is long past, just reading an excerpt from it, the time is long past when agreements, even those under seal, were isolated from the matrix of facts in which they were set and interpreted purely on internal linguistic considerations. We must inquire beyond the language and see what the circumstances were with reference to which the words were used and the object appearing from those circumstances which the person using them had in view. Now, this case is a demarcation point. Up until that time, courts would only interpret the contract and the words in the contract. Nothing else could be used. And they would take a sort of literal approach to the words of the contract. Lord Wilberforce is marking the end of that period and the beginning of a new one in which we look at what's often called the factual matrix. Factual matrix is sort of a fancy way of saying the background against which the contract was made and what the contract says. So in Pren, the excerpt that I've given and that I read, Wilberforce is saying that time of just looking at contracts on their internal linguistic considerations is ended, and we have to look beyond just what the words say and look at the circumstances of the contract. So to illustrate, a shipping contract or a construction contract, you look at the setting of the contract and don't be blind to that. Because within certain industries, there are certain customs, or there are certain meanings, certain understandings. And a few years later, he comes back to the point in Reardon Smith, and just reading a few excerpts from the quotation I've given you. No contracts are made in a vacuum. In a commercial contract, it is certainly right that the court should know the commercial purpose of the contract, and this in turn presupposes knowledge of the genesis of the transaction, the background, the context, the market in which the parties are operating. When one speaks of the intention of the parties to the contract, one is speaking objectively. And what must be ascertained is what is to be taken as the intention which reasonable people would have had if placed in the situation of the parties. And at the end, what the court must do to place itself in thought in the same factual matrix as that in which the parties were. So Reardon Smith is giving authority for what I was saying about looking at the context in which the contract was formed, the background against which the contract was written. So, for example, a certain industry.
Well, that's still, I guess, not opening the door for parole evidence every time, right?
No.
It's just about the means, about the contract, not
Right,
about the
so
terms.
parole evidence would be an example of extrinsic evidence.
Yes.
And when could it come in? Well, we have, if you remember the dry cleaning case. It was in the notes, I don't think we discussed it. Somebody brings in her wedding dress to be dry cleaned.
It's about the
And the attendant says, sign this, and on it, it has an exclusion of liability, and the customer says, what's this? And the attendant says, oh, well, that just deals with sequins and beads on your dress. It excludes liability for damage to those. When in fact, that wasn't what the exclusion clause was trying to do. It was trying to exclude all liability for anything. That was an example of parole evidence, because at the time of formation, the written contract was very oral. And so that was essential to the forming of the contract, that interpretation of the clause, or that understanding of the clause. But the courts are reluctant to bring in extrinsic evidence like parole evidence because they feel that that will elongate the time for argument. That a 2-day trial can become a 4-day trial because you have all these people coming in. So they try to stop that at the outset.
Well, when it comes to meaning, determining the meaning, extrinsic evidence appears is relevant and can be entered into evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Not in terms of the contract, whether the contract was complete or not, but when it comes to the actual meaning of the word or clause or phrase or what the parties intended to do.
Yeah, but the courts don't want to get into definitions. Sometimes you'll see in cases they'll quote from a dictionary. Generally, they don't like. They don't want to get into that.
But if the international law is subject of the contract, they're allowed to have an expert on the international law.
But expert evidence is different. So expert evidence is there's a custom within this industry, and the expert is adducing evidence regarding that custom. Tenish?
David, I'm just kind of looking back at Lord Wilberforce's guidance here.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is something that comes second from in the first instance, one looks at the four corners of the contract itself for plain in language, plain terms of the contract. And in the event there's ambiguity, then you turn to the contextual and factual.
Not
Because
necessarily.
That seems to be the premise.
Not necessarily. I think what Lord Wilberforce is saying is there's a context within which contracts are made. If we focus on commercial contracts, which I'm going to limit our discussion to, commercial contracts are made within specific industries. And that's what he's trying to bring in here, that there's a backdrop or a setting within which the parties have contracted.
But if the contract itself, looking at the plain language of the contract, clearly states without ambiguity the
Then
freedom
there
of the
shouldn't be
two
an
parties,
Yeah.
and there's no need for a contextual
Then there shouldn't
or...
be an issue, but all the cases that go to court, there have been plausible arguments on either side. So that's what we're looking at. So in our day-to-day, I think you learned in foundations, was it 90% of cases don't reach trial? In the day-to-day, that's what informs you, but you keep in mind what happens at the litigation stage and the different interpretations. So you're sort of encompassing that 100%, if that makes sense.
No, I understand, but it's only in the case of an ambiguity or dispute, and then it becomes necessary to look beyond the
Right.
four corners of the contract.
But I find it interesting how violently people's interpretations differ when money's on the line. So, yeah. We'll take a break until 50, and we'll come back to the heading for something that's commercially absurd. So we've talked enough, I think, about Schuler. Consolidated Bathurst, Mr. Justice Yakabushi, no, it wasn't him at that time, sorry. The court says, where the works may bear two constructions, the more reasonable one, that which produces a fair result, must certainly be taken as the interpretation which will promote the intention of the parties. So in a lay sense, we're talking about what would make common sense here. But as you've probably found, there's nothing common about common sense. So I have two examples, and I know they're both UK decisions. Rainy Sky is referred to in some of the contract textbooks. I think these illustrate the point a bit better. So let's look at Rainy Sky first. I think I'll give you a summary, so I'll give you a minute to reread it.
Rainy Sky, right?
Excuse me. Before moving to this contract, may I ask a question about the section 12142, giving effect to all parts of the agreement. I have a question about the section 142.
What was the title?
Yeah, giving effect to all parts of the agreement.
In interpretation?
Yeah, 142.
Yeah, I have different numbering in mind.
The account of construction giving effect to all parts of the agreement. Yeah?
Yeah.
Take a 10-page contract, and suppose that the earlier phrases in the first page come in conflict with the last phrases in the last pages. How would you deal with this conflict? And how would we interpret this conflict?
Well,
The first,
yeah, go ahead.
the first page, the earlier phrases come in conflict
Yeah.
with the last page,
Yeah.
the last phrases.
So what the courts would likely do, and before you came in, I just read a portion from the Supreme Court of Canada case. It says it has to make commercial common sense, basically. So if there's a conflict between words at page 1 and then words at page 10, then the court will be asked to reconcile them in a way that makes sense, looking at the contract as a whole. So if there, like say there are two interpretations.
Can we interpret the contract in this way? Because the last intention of parties are expressed in the last phrases.
Yeah, I don't know if they would take that idea, because we can't necessarily presume that the contract was written and negotiated from page 1 to page 10. Page 10 might have been negotiated first, and so on.
We don't know which
Yeah.
part is the
And
last
that would be
intention of parties.
extrinsic evidence that the court probably wouldn't want to bring in.
I see.
So the idea would be the court would have to assess on an objective basis what interpretation of the best reconciles the two conflicts or the conflicting words. So that's why, just before you came in, I asked people to reread the note on rainy sky, and then we'll look at Arnold as written. And I think, or I hope at least, this will get into some of how the courts reconcile things that may seem to be contradictory or conflicting. So, rainy sky, what is it about? Factually.
Advance payment bond.
Sorry?
Advance payment bond.
Okay. Who are the parties?
Bank.
So the parties are the ship owning, one of the ship owning, ship owning firm, and the James ship owning company, and there was a bond between Rainy Sky and the bank.
So the manufacturer of the ship was sort of, this isn't a precise term, but underwritten by the bank. So if something happened to the ship company, the shipbuilding company, the bank, according to the contract, may step in within certain circumstances and cover the Rainy Sky, who is the buyer. So the issue here is, arguably, so the issue here is whether or not the circumstances in paragraph 3 have been triggered. And obviously, since this got to the Supreme Court, there's a difference of interpretation. So the key part of clause 3, I'll just read it out. We hereby, as primary obligor, irrevocably and unconditionally undertake to pay to you, your successors and assigns, on your first written demand, all such sums due to you under the contract, for such sums which would have been due to you, but for any irregularity, illegality, invalidity, or unenforceability in whole or in part of the contract, provided that the total amount recoverable by you under this bond should not exceed close to 27 million plus interest. So the question that arose here is whether or not clause 3 was triggered when the shipbuilder became insolvent. what are the two arguments available here?
One of the arguments is that common sense interpretation, that any sound, such sound, if we said to pay, includes insolvency, because that's what happened, right? That, in the end, the shipbuilding company was bankrupt. So therefore, all the prepayment of the, I guess it was in question, right?
Yeah.
And the other interpretation is that they never explicitly said anything about insolvency. They were only talking about loss of the vessel or partly, loss of, termination. We never talked about any insolvency issue.
So, and I think I gave you the portion of the Court of Appeal that the Supreme Court brought in, that they rely on. It defies commercial common sense to think that this, among all other such obligations, was the only one which the parties intended should not be secured. Had the parties intended this surprising result, I would have expected the contracts and the bonds to have spelled this out clearly, but they do not do so. So what the court is saying is, if we look at the whole contract, the parties have been meticulous about assigning responsibility or risk. And the bank's interpretation is, well, in this one instance, we didn't do that. Yeah. And the buyer is saying, obviously, well, no, you look at the term's been triggered. And actually, the court goes so far as to say it's implausible that that's actually what you intended. Because if you intended that, given how meticulous you were 9 out of the 10 times, we would expect you would have turned your attention to be a bit more detailed as to that one time that is aberrant out of the 10. So when we're looking at these two different interpretations, one that says by the buyers, the risks have been allocated, and the argument by the bank that says, well, in this one case, we didn't stipulate anything. The court says, we reject the bank's interpretation and look at the buyer's interpretation because it's consistent with how the contract has been constructed. That the parties have been meticulous about assigning risk and responsibility within the parties. So going back to your question, if we have this ambiguity between the terms, one of the ways we can look at it is, well, hold on. What does the contract say as a whole? Does it stipulate in this circumstance, if X happens, then party 1 has a responsibility? And in this contract they had, throughout, let's say there are 10 clauses.
You mean that the 4 corners of contract?
Yeah. And the court is saying it's implausible to interpret the contract in the way that the bank is trying to assert, because it doesn't make commercial common sense with this contract. If we take an alternative, we say, well, it was ambiguous throughout as to who bore the risk, then maybe there's more of an argument to say that the bank has a plausible position. But the Supreme Court said, well, this is just implausible, what the bank is asserting, the bank's interpretation of the contract. Because if we read it as a whole, it was meticulous as to how it arranged affairs. And we're being told by the bank, this happened to be the one instance where they were ambiguous. We don't accept that. So that'd be one way of reconciling the different interpretations or some sort of ambiguity. I'll give you a minute to read the Arnold and Britton summary. What is this case about? What's at stake here? Sorry?
Annual service fees paid by the tenant.
And how much was the annual service fee?
For some tenants, it was relatively low, but for the tenants that included the equipment and the others, it came to 2,700.
It kept going up.
Yeah.
And this was a lease that they signed for 99 years. And in it,
Every year, 10%.
Every year it will go up.
yeah. So the argument for the tenants is, well, hold on. You're saying the management fee will go up 10% every year. Eventually, the fee is going to outstrip what we actually paid. That doesn't make sense. So this couldn't be the interpretation of the contract. Who would ever agree to that? Well, according to the Supreme Court, they did. So why did the court decide that way? I'll draw your attention to, in the summary I gave you, under Lord Neuberger and under Held, paragraphs 17 and 18. The reliance placed in some cases on commercial common sense and surrounding circumstances should not be invoked to undervalue the importance of the language of the provision which is to be construed. The less clear words are, the more ready the court can be to depart from their natural meaning. But the clearer the natural meaning, the more difficult it is to justify departing from it. The court should not embark on an exercise of searching for drafting infelicities in order to facilitate a departure from the natural meaning. What they're saying here is, we're asked to interpret the contract, and we're going to look at what the contract says. We know what Lord Wilberforce said. We keep that in mind. But there's only so much we can do when the words are clear. And the words clearly state, you agreed to a 10% per annum increase over 99 years. So we can't just step in and say, no, that doesn't be. You agreed to it. You are a sophisticated commercial party. You had an opportunity to talk to lawyers. You are basically coming to us saying, we don't like how this is operating. Let us get out of it. And the Supreme Court is saying, no, We're not going to do that. So the factual matrix works, but you can't use it in a way that draws the court into rectifying what one party feels is a bad deal. The words don't allow it. Now, I also gave you an excerpt from the dissent that says basically, this is crazy. Nobody agrees to this. Something must have gone wrong. And I have some sympathy for the tenants on this. Because sometimes you miss things. Sometimes you haven't really thought things through. Or maybe your lawyers missed it. Because this is a bit absurd, that you could actually be paying more out per year, arguably, than what you put down originally. But this is another one of those cases, I think, that tells us where the courts are at. And that is, the courts here are reiterating that they will not let people out of bargains they feel are bad after they've agreed to them. Arguably, something went wrong here. But it's not the job of the court to help parties. It's the job of the court to interpret the contract. The contract is clear. And it cannot just interfere arbitrarily, because that would violate freedom of contract. And everybody has freedom of the contract, which means you have freedom to sign a good deal and you have freedom to sign a bad deal. But it's not up to the court to save you from the latter.
Basically, they want to amend. They want the court to amend.
Yeah.
It's not an interpretation.
Their argument is interpretation.
Yes, the argument
They're
is
saying, well,
interpretation.
hold on.
Actually, they want
There's a
the court
factual
to amend.
matrix. This doesn't work. This doesn't make commercial common sense. And the Supreme Court rejects that. So the reason that I put this case in is, I think this one in Rainy Sky, is I think they contrast better this idea of interpretation that we've been talking about in construction of contracts. And you get, this is my opinion, you get better commercial cases from the UK than in Canada. There's just more of them until October 31st.
The fact that some of the owners pay different, would it make any difference?
No, because, well, that was the deal. So if you live in a condo in
I
Toronto.
remember in property case, we had a case where there was something like this, that it was not fair, the
But
part of the, it is not condo, it was also some.
No, but if we use the analogy of a condo, people have units of different sizes. So the fees will be proportionate to the size.
But here it was not, the difference was not because of the sizes, the difference was when we divide the, but that's a property issue, I guess.
Yeah, but also the price went up. Yeah, they didn't have to buy.
Yeah, but these maintenance costs were supposed to, it's renewal and all kind of maintenance fees supposed to be proportional.
Oh, the issue of the
Between the
property.
part,
No, no,
between
the-
all the tenants, no? And
Sorry?
here it looks like the one who bought earlier paid much less, and the maintenance is not less.
Oh, you're talking about restricted covenants, which is, they're saying
Yes.
that you cannot impose the positive obligation on the property owner. But this is about the leasehold, and this is completely different kind of thing.
Yeah, and so
It's
they
a
keep in
maintenance.
mind in the UK, it's kind of crazy in the UK. People some people don't actually own the home they're in, like the property. What they have is somebody else owns the land, and they rent it for 99 years. So there's some very well-off people, let's call them the Downton Abbey people, Lord Grantham and so on. They own all the land that everybody lives on. They're still getting rent.
So the houses are fixtures, but they're not owned by the tenants.
Yeah.
Wow.
Whereas in Canada, you buy a home, you own it.
Well,
In the
not
UK,
really, the
Not
town
really,
owns
the crown
everything.
owns the land.
But it's not like a private person owns the land that your home is on.
Oh,
Yeah, you buy the land actually, not the house.
Yeah, but in the UK, you buy your home, but it just so happens your home is on somebody else's land. So that's a key difference, I think, here in terms of.
Excuse me, how about the good faith? They didn't talk about like
Yeah, but
kind
it
of
says that
good
in England
faith
there's no
or
good
etc.
faith, that's why it's.
Yeah, well, was there bad faith?
It could be.
How?
I mean, in terms of maybe.
Well, if you don't read a clear
Because I
contract.
cannot explain, but maybe it could be bad faith.
Yeah, but like, I wouldn't accept that. Like, I understand your point. Maybe there's a bad faith argument here. I think lots of commercial contracts, there are abstractly bad faith arguments.
Well, they're more-
Generally speaking, in the common law, that's not accepted. There's no such thing as good faith in the UK.
If something is morally despicable, that still doesn't mean that it's a bad faith. It's just a bad taste.
Yeah, so
That's all.
the difference here, as I said earlier, is there's freedom to contract. And you can sign a bad deal or a good deal. And if you don't know you're signing a bad deal, you bear the risk of that, is what the Supreme Court is saying. So minus any sort of misrepresentation or duress or other vitiating factor, the courts aren't going to inject themselves into an agreement that, I think if we got the justices aside, they'd agree something went wrong here. But it's not our job to fix that.
That's wrong.
That's wrong?
Yeah, I don't know.
But
I don't know, just the context, this context just tells me something wrong in injustice itself.
it sucks.
Yeah.
But I can't say it's wrong. Like, I don't think the Supreme Court was wrong. If I'm the tenant, I'm unhappy. But I signed the agreement. And that's what the court is saying. So, put another way, a theme we've looked at is the court is going to reiterate that formation of contract is an important dimension of contract. If you sign it, you own it. Mine is something extraordinary.
When we talk about the party was sophisticated, let's say we had an unsophisticated party.
That could be different, like an individual,
Yes.
the Lord Denning's sad old lady kind of scenario.
So
That would
the
be
fact
different.
that they were both commercial and they had such a lawyer, that was like it was like, I think we consider the case was good because there was this principle of sanctity of contracts, and if we could easily break contracts when we have injustice, then it would be create uncertainty.
Yeah.
So it's good that we know when there is a contract, unless some very serious reason of misrepresentation or something else.
Well, and here, I think we could say there's something debatable, but the court took the more conservative interpretation.
And this free market economy is based on that. Like if somebody.
Yeah. Yeah. There were a few hands. And then, Sparta, you had a hand. I'll come back to you.
what would be the way out for the tenant? Like if
Other
the-
than crying?
Yeah, like if the tenant says, I'm not going to perform this contract, so would the landlord be able to claim damages for the
Yeah, if you
whole
threaten breach of
99
contract.
years?
If you threaten breach of contract, and it's liquidated damages, meaning in the contract it states what would be owed, then you have a problem. But I agree, to the point earlier, it's not a good circumstance if you're the tenant. But I think we have to look at, what's the saying in English? Buy in haste, repent at leisure. So if you purchase something quickly, without much thought, like a new car, you have all this time to contemplate what a bad decision you made. So these people have, I think the lease ran for 20 years, so another 70 years to contemplate their poor decision.
I mean, if the tenant said, okay, I'm going to terminate this contract, I'm not going to perform, would the landlord be under the duty to mitigate the
They may be. But I say it's kind of different here. Like if this is their home, that's a bit of a different thought. Yes. Spartak and then Ebra.
Like, is it more likely in Canada for courts to adopt more liberal interpretation than the English courts?
I think you'll see a bit more of a liberal interpretation. I don't know in this circumstance if it would have been different though. It just so happens, I would say, that the facts seem harsh, but what should the court have done would be the question.
I think they could have touched this often terms similar in all respect to the other reasons, and it's not the same. The terms are different for those who started, who bought
But that's not
lease from the
unusual.
70s.
But that's not unusual.
But they could have said that, okay, let's make all of them the same.
I don't think that'd be realistic though. Because, like, if you have this property that lots of people all of a sudden want to buy into, naturally the free market says, I'll raise the price.
Yeah, the price, yes, but this is maintenance.
Yeah, but
And the maintenance fee, how come that we have 100 chalets and 70 pays 3 times as much for the maintenance and 20 pays
But
half,
that was the-
when it says everybody should pay the same?
But that was the contract that was signed.
But then the preamble is not true. The preamble says that everybody pays the same or similar.
Spartak.
Could the court treat this with consideration?
How?
Not the project they are renting. Like, I'm not disputing that. I'm disputing the fact that they would have to pay this certain amount every year that keeps increasing. So now the court, in a way, could have said that, well, like, what is the consideration that is being given and is being taken? In this case, when it's pre-made, doesn't have to go so, like, I don't know if court could have, like, explored this idea to
Theoretically, sure. But I don't know if that would have changed the outcome here. Enrico.
Just to give a real life example, when I negotiated the lease for my office space, everybody that signed the lease, when you were before me, had a clause that said that the fee line, taxes, maintenance, insurance, can be adjusted accordingly if the property management company undervalues the costs. And so I caught that clause, and I said to the landlord, no, I'm not going to sign this back. I want a 5% cap per annum, because that basically said, if they were way out of whack, like what happened this year, they tried to send me a bill for $600 million, increase because they were off in their expenses. Everybody else in everybody else in our unit, all the other renters actually had to pay it. And I went back and said, no, this was taken out of my contract. So you have to be very aware of what you're signing. And I don't move the contract, but that clause just struck me when I read it myself and said, look, this gives the part carte blanche. But had I signed it, had I signed the offer as it was, it's done. I'm locked into whatever increase they want. And I can cry to court and say, look, $1,000 increase in TMI is ridiculous because your property management company can't manage the books correctly, but everybody else in the condo was stuck to the, they were held to it. They tried to complain because I actually caught the condos and they didn't. Everybody got stuck paying us. I mean, that's a harsh lesson for everybody else. You really got it.
Well, also, what I say is, sort of for our purposes, whether it's exam or advice, don't, be careful about getting caught up with the sympathetic client or the sympathetic party. Sometimes, as in this case, the law operates in a way that doesn't seem fair, but that's the way it operates. Yeah.
On the facts of the case, these one fact that actually there are 14 E-types included in 14 out of 21 lease. One related explanation provided as to why in these 14 lease the key terms is italicized, and whether this will give some kind of indication there are special meaning given to these words so that they are capable of a different or alternative meaning, and this will trigger the principle applied in the previous case, ready sky. So it means that when you italicize the words, you are indicating that you want to give some special meaning to these words. And if this means, then this will open up the possibility that this can be interpreted in a different way. Because it's the case summary also gets the facts that they are italicized in it. In the summary means this is a key material facts. I don't know what the bearing of those facts.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of a way to articulate it better. Why I don't think it would. It seems to me you have to establish that the use of italics, it has a different meaning.
Yeah, it signifies something that's special.
And I don't know, I think that would be, thinking of a factual matrix, I think that would be extrinsic evidence for the court. Because, some parts are italicized for whatever reason. They draw the attention of the party to it. Here's different font. So I don't think anything definitive can be argued just based on that. We have to move on. List of particulars followed by general language, Atlantic paper stock versus St. Anne Mackerel. So the scope of the general phrase in a contract is limited by the common characteristics of the class or genus of the particularized items. And we have an example. I didn't give you the case summary, but the case is in the textbook. I'll read to you the portion from the...
Which case is it?
Atlantic paper, so.
So the clause says, St. Anne warrants and represents that its requirements under this contract shall be approximately 15,000 tons a year. It further warrants that in any 1 year its requirements for secondary fiber shall not be less than 10,000 tons, unless, as a result of an act of God, the Queen's or public enemies, war, the authority of the law, labor unrest or strikes, the destruction of or damage to production facilities, or the non-availability of markets for pulp or corrugating media. So this is a contract by a paper company to buy materials for their business. And the clause says, we agree, we will be bound to buy between 15,000 and 10,000 tons of product a year. Unless something. Now, the key part in this phrase that was at issue was the last part that I read out. The non-availability of markets for pulp or corrugating medium. What does that mean, do you think?
I would say that it's some objective issue happening on the market of pulp or corrugating medium. So say this market crashed and
yeah, everybody went digital, and nobody needs paper.
Is it anticipating a force majeure condition? Is that what's going on?
It's trying to explain a force majeure, when a force majeure comes into effect. But the particular issue here is the non-availability of markets.
There's markets,
I think
only sentence in Puglia.
I think this
So,
claim that the non-availability in market was specific to this company. It's a pretty weird interpretation when you talk about force majeure, because how can force majeure be something that you're influencing? You know, if for example you don't market yourself, you don't promote yourself, you ran out of business, and then you say, oh, it's force majeure, but this was caused by your actions or inaction.
Yeah, well, and that's what the court ruled.
If we had only the word non-availability of markets, it would be ambiguous what it would mean. But because it's put in the context of an act of God, the Queen's Republic and war, all these are outside events where the government doesn't have any control. So it's over them. So it's also an event, it should be an event that the business has no control, not something.
Right, and that's the definition of the Latin term used in generis that we're applying here. The scope of the general phrase, what I read out in a contract, is limited by the common characteristics of the class or genus of the particularized items. Constantina says, well, the common theme amongst each of these is something out of the hands of St. Anne, something it has no control over. Well, what if St. Anne just sucks at running a business? And that's why they don't have a market, which is what happened. And the Supreme Court says, well, that doesn't qualify here. You remain on the hook for the 15 to 10,000 tons. So your argument that you could apply non-availability of markets when your business went down is implausible here because that clause eliminates the possibility. The common theme in each of those, and that we import to the ambiguous phrase of non-availability of markets, is that it's out of your hands. You have control, however, over how you run your business. And if you run it poorly, you suffer the consequences.
It says although there was some decrease, but less of an effective marketing plan and inordinate operating costs result in failure for which and must be expensive.
Yeah. So I'm going to skip to implied terms, just to set up Monday. We'll pick up with implied terms. But implied terms, I find people will often argue implied terms. And it suggests that there's this idea that implied terms are more common than they actually are. The court's power to imply a term into a contract is used sparingly. Situating this within the ongoing discussion we've had, there's freedom to contract. The parties will contract, the courts will hold them to that bargain. One party saying, well, you have to imply a term here, is asking the court to interject itself into something that it was not a party to. And courts are reluctant to do that, except in particular circumstances. So this isn't a power that is commonly used. And what you have to draw from that is, if you think your argument is implied terms, look for another one. It may well be only implied terms, but you have to understand that if you go to court with only that one, you might not have the strongest of cases. So what we're looking at here is how terms are separated or categorized when we're looking at implied terms. So we have terms that are implied by statute. Sale of Goods Act will imply certain terms. I've given you an example from section 13. Terms may be implied by the courts. This is where we're asking the courts to use their power. And the common separation of categories has been terms implied in fact, terms implied by custom, and terms implied in law. Simply put, terms implied by custom are saying, well, there is a custom in this industry that wasn't spoken to directly in the contract, but this is how we operate. Terms implied in fact are implied when the court feels that it's necessary to imply this term to give an unexpressed intention of the parties. In this particular contract, terms implied in law say contracts of this type. For example, the first case you have is a tenancy contract. In tenancy contracts, there will be certain implied terms. Another example, in employment contracts, there will be certain implied terms. So terms implied in fact refer to the specific facts of the circumstance in this case. Terms implied in law refer to a category of contracts, like a tenancy contract or an employment contract. And this is to set up our discussion about good faith as well. Is good faith an implied term in Canada? In the UK, they hate it. There is no such thing as good faith. They get very angry about it. Whereas my understanding in civil law jurisdictions, good faith is a long-held concept, depending on the jurisdiction. But often in civil law jurisdictions, it is an accepted concept with a history behind it. Canada is unique insofar as it has only recently recognized good faith, but only for the performance of a contract, not in the negotiation of a contract. The difference being, there's no obligation to negotiate in good faith, but there is an obligation once you have a contract to perform your obligations in good faith. And on the good faith topic, I sent an email earlier today giving you a recent case. I thought it'd be better to give you the shorter one than the longer one. So you have the Ontario Court of Appeal decision, that's 8 pages, as compared to the British Columbia case, which is over 40. But as I said in the email, I think both have been given leave to appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. And I think they would be likely decided together. So we'll pick up with that, implied terms and good faith on Monday and exclusion clauses. Yeah.
My question goes back again to the interpretation.
Yeah.
In terms of Canada Supreme Court supervision and controlling, the issue of interpretation is the matter of fact or the matter of law or both of them?
The interpretation should be a matter of the law.
You mean that Supreme Court can supervise the judgment of the trial court?
No, that would be fact. The law would be, so when you appeal to the Supreme Court, it'd be very rare if you could get leave to appeal based on fact. You'd have to show that the lower courts and at the Supreme Court level, trial and court of appeal can step on the fact. That'd be very exceptional. So it'd only be the law that you're appealing on. Yeah.
So is it good faith, topic good faith, is an extension of implied terms?
That's how we'll look at it, yeah.